Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar about creating an LGBTQ+ inclusive curriculum. Thank you so much for coming along today. I'm Roisin Leahy, a content editor at Collins, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce John McCulloch and Lindsay Skinner. John McCulloch is an award-winning poet who also teaches creative writing courses at the University of Brighton. His first poetry collection, The Frost Bears, won the Polari First Book Prize, and his latest collection, featuring queer coal, is Reckless Paper Birds. This book won the Hawthornden Prize in 2020. And Lindsay Skinner is the head teacher of a secondary school in Devon. She's written for The Guardian about the importance of LGBTQ+ representation in schools. And Lindsay has also written books to support English teaching, including Crafting Brilliant Sentences, and she contributed to Collins' Key Stage 3 anthology, Who We Are, which features John's poem, Queer Coal. So Lindsay and John will be speaking today about John's poem and the lesson that Lindsay wrote around this, as well as having a wider discussion about how we can ensure that our curriculum and classrooms are as LGBTQ+ inclusive as possible. So Lindsay and John will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session to take us to 5 p.m. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat at any point, and Lindsay and John will do their best to answer them at the end. We'd also like to encourage you to share any insight and ideas about how you might have created an LGBTQ+ inclusive classroom and anything that's worked for you. So please do share your experiences in the chat if you would like to. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and you will be sent a link to the recording after the webinar. And everyone here who's here today will be entered into a prize draw to win a copy of our Key Stage 3 anthology, Who We Are, which will be announced after the webinar is finished. So I'll now hand over to Lindsay, who I think is going to give a bit more information, and hope you will really enjoy what promises to be a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Roisin. So I worked with the team at HarperCollins to collect together some poems and some texts that would really represent the kids that we've got in front of us, so that it wouldn't just be a curriculum in English that was dead white heterosexual men. And we put together loads and loads of texts, and we must have read hundreds between us. But one that I slipped in hoping that it would be selected, and it was rated by everyone as them wanting it to be included in the Key Stage 3 anthology, and them really liking the text itself, but also thinking it was important in terms of what it was exploring for our kids, was Queer Coal. And John's obviously wrote Queer Coal, but the poem itself, and he's going to read it shortly, but it explores the themes of homophobia and homosexuality, but it does it through an extended metaphor, through the extended metaphor of a counterfeit coin. And then there's a lesson about this, and it leads on to some creative writing in the lesson. But it really is a poem that it's just got layers and layers of meaning. I think it is a brilliant one for creative writing as a spark and a jump for the kids, but also it's great for analysis. So I think before we talk too much about the poem, it probably makes sense that you should hear it. So I'm going to pass over to John, and John's going to read the poem for you. John.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, so much. It's lovely to be here, and yeah, to be interviewed by yourself. Yeah, as I was saying before, I find Lindsay's own story really inspirational. So I wrote this poem, Queer Coal, a while ago. It's part of Reckless Paper Birds, which is my most recent book, and it was inspired by the fact that I've often collected little counterfeit coins over the years when I've got them in my change, and I wasn't sure why I was doing it, but I felt a kind of identification with them in some ways. The poem Queer Coal is all about the idea of passing and masking, and what's counterfeit and what's real. And yeah, I will read it to you now. Queer Coal. You tumbled into my palm in a trickle of sterling. Bad coin, foul queen, though I didn't notice. I pocketed you, conveyed you like your sedan chair, respectfully slotted you into vending machines that coughed you out. You winked at me from a change tray, and abruptly I spotted everything about you was wrong. Your weight, your ill-defined milled edge, your obverse skewed. Not copper, zinc, nickel, but lead sprayed with gold paint. Too shiny. Queer Coal, they used to say, meaning counterfeit or base money, what ends up improperly beside your person, tilting the system, forcing each wall, mutilating the weather. Fucking queer, a voice in the Watford crowd snarled as my lips brushed Ryan's cheek. There I was, my mouth mimicking legit, my hoodie, cap, trackies, like a man's, but on close inspection, awry. My voice too light, edges blurred, flickery. I carry this awareness in my blood, how simply I'm revealed as undermining the currency, warping the ceiling. Now, coin, I keep you squirreled in my wallet's secret section. You are my talisman. Return me to what I am. No pink pound, but queer coal, rebel head, wonky origin, dangerous minting.
Thank you. I love that poem. So there are a few things that I wanted to talk to you about, like why you wanted to explore those particular things. And so the first thing is it a true story, the Watford game, and the having to hide and pretend that you're a heterosexual man with a tracksuit? And has that been a deliberate part of your growing up?
Yeah, in this case, I mean, not all of my poems are directly about my own experience, but this one is. So I am from Watford originally. I came from a working class background. So the school that I went to was in the bottom portion of the league tables whenever they were published in the Daily Mirror each year. My school was always in the bottom little bit, because it was a sink school that took in all the kids that were expelled from other schools in the region. And I think it's fair to say that it could often be quite a rough place. And so I did feel the need to hide. And certainly, this was also the time of Section 28. This is the 1990s when I was at secondary school. And so there was no discussion in class about these things. And yeah, I had lots of slurs before I knew myself that I was gay. It was just something in the playground. It was a word. And then eventually, later on, I decided I was. But I was still very conscious about the potential for violent reactions if my passing failed, if people, spotted that I was gay on the street in Watford. It's very different to where I live now. I live in Brighton and Hove now. And yeah, it's really not something that I think about at all or worry about. But growing up, definitely it was something that I thought about quite a lot.
You kind of mention this, you make a reference to the idea that it's that blurring of the lines where your sexual orientation or your sexual identity or your gender identity might not be as binary as people assume or presume it will be, and that might threaten people. Do you think that that's something that is still prominent now? So you're talking about the 1990s back then, but do you think that that's still something that's problematic at the present time, which is why the poem still works?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I've always been drawn to the word queer because of its history as originally a slur, and before that, a long history in English. So I did many years ago a PhD in Renaissance stuff, and that's where I found out about the term queer coal being current in that time for counterfeit money. But I think it is very relevant today in terms of the reactions that not just people who are gay experience, but people who are trans or non-binary, that there is this nervousness about anything which doesn't fit into the conventional model of how a man is, how a woman is. So even though things have changed since the 90s to a huge degree, and certainly there's a lot more broad acceptance of homosexuality than when I was growing up, I think that this area is still very relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And obviously, I live in Devon, which is quite different from Brighton, and probably has less representation, certainly of ethnic minorities and of LGBTQ people. But I would say it's better than it was in the 1990s, and that's definitely something to be hopeful about. I wanted to talk a bit more widely about the poems in the collection. So obviously this one is exploring homophobia and some of the challenges that face and about masking. But the wider set of poems, what themes do they explore?
Oh, in Rex Paper Birds, do you mean?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually it's a collection which is themed around the vulnerability of the body and experiences of queerness, both in terms of homophobia but also joy. So yeah, it's quite a happy book. There's quite a lot of love poems. My favorite things to write are love poems, I guess, because they come from a place very deep and true from the relationship that I'm in, and again, it's something that you definitely didn't see growing up. Like the narratives around queerness were all about either homophobia or coming out, or just in a crime drama, say, like, you know, so often the murderer would turn out to be a repressed, you know, gay man or lesbian or trans person. And so just putting queer joy out there into the world, I think is quite radical in itself. And the book does both things. So there are some darker poems about concentration camps for gay men in Chechnya, other poems about experiences of homophobia I've had on trains, but there's also quite a lot of celebration, not only of my own experiences of love, but of other queer lives. So there are a number of poems which explore, which have other queer people in, so lesbian characters, non-binary characters. And yeah, I think generally where I live now, I'm quite fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of people who aren't heterosexual and or cis. And yeah, and the book's informed by that.
In this poem specifically, you've got quite an interesting choice of structure. And I just wanted to unpick with you. I find structuring writing with children, when we teach structure of writing and analysing structure, always quite a challenge. I wanted to unpick with you some of the choices that you made in terms of structure and why.
Yeah.
So it's in the double line structure, and then lots of spaces between different phrases. Why did you make those choices, and what was your intended outcome for those?
So I think it was mainly to slow the poem down. I think it is definitely a to-read poem. It's very much reliant on imagery. It's very much reliant on people picturing the coin. And I think that it helps to give people time to do that. So whereas my love poems often have quite a fast pace, so they'll have quite long lines and sentences to rush the reader through and conjure up excitement. With this poem, I didn't want to do that. I wanted the reader to encounter lots of gaps so that it would have time to digest the imagery. And I suppose at a visual level, I quite like the idea that the little phrases are almost kind of like coins on the page, I suppose. But yeah, I definitely wanted to make things much slower so that people would have time to picture what was being described.
The wordplay in this poem is quality, like the foul queen. I love that little bit of wordplay. It really made me smile. It almost feels quite playful, which is interesting in a poem about homophobia. Is that juxtaposed deliberate, or is it just a reflection of who you are as a human?
I think a bit of both. I was always surprised that so often with my poems that I think of as serious poems, that other people would find the humor in them. And I think it's partly, maybe it's a queer way of seeing the world. I think that because it was growing up so strange to be queer, it was so surreal to be you know, not heterosexual. I think that yeah, I naturally reach for humor and oddness and strangeness and you know, the laughs around that. So yeah, I think that I do it more deliberately now, but I think it's just the way that I tend to see the world, if that makes sense. Anyway, I tend to find the humor in most things. And yeah, I liked the idea of like, because yeah, you always have this floating queen's head on the coin and on stamps, etc., of having a relationship with that. And I like I like to write things which have dark humor. There's both kind of fun on the surface, and then obviously that phrase also has a deeper meaning around perhaps internalized homophobia, which I think has always been a big thing for LGBT people. And you know, obviously internalized lesbophobia, transphobia, whatever, just, you know, absorbing negative phrases that you hear, and kind of, you know, that voice kind of goes around your head a bit.
Yeah, and you definitely get that serious undertone, because it's interesting, there's some nice wordplay, and it does feel a little bit playful, and then it's juxtaposed with, in the italics, fucking queer, which then feels really quite stark, especially as I haven't heard that kind of pejorative. I've heard it several times in my life, but like aimed towards me or so directly at me for like quite some time that it feels so stark on the page. And then that against some of the more playful stuff is, I think it hits home that message of, you know, there's like the who you are and some of the playfulness of it, and then actually the serious consequences that can happen when people are homophobic. I almost thought that I wasn't going to get this poem through into a Key Stage 3 anthology because it had that phrasing in it. How important do you think it is that kids at Key Stage 3 explore that kind of language, and why it's not okay? I think, yeah, why it's not okay to use those kind of phrases.
I think that I would have found it really important. I mean, I must say, it's the first time I ever have sworn in a poem that was published. And so, yeah, I was surprised that this was the poem that was chosen too. It is quite a shocking use of language, and a difficult phrase that has, yeah, stuck with me, because I've encountered it on the street from people. If I have, especially if I've kissed a friend of mine, goodbye or something, you know, and it's in the evening, and there's you know, someone's had a lot to drink that's walking past, then it would be something like that. I think that it's important that people do talk about why these phrases aren't used. At the moment, there's the annual debate around the use of the word faggot in Fairy Tale of New York, the Christmas song, and how different it feels when you're on the side of, you know, when you're part of the group which has had that word aimed at you, you know, and when it's not just a fun thing to shout out, you know, a fun, shocking word. When you've actually experienced that, it's very different. And I think it's good for people to think about why certain words are used by particular communities, and, you know, why it wouldn't be okay for someone outside that community to use that word.
It's interesting you start like touching on reclaiming the language there, because I was thinking, have I ever had that insult thrown at me? And mostly no, but fucking dyke, yes, a lot. And much less so, I would say, in the 10 years, but in the, you know, before that, a lot. And I really don't like the word dyke, I think as a result, because it's always been accompanied with some kind of physical threat or intimidation and those kind of things. And so it's always something that I would avoid using. And you've sort of touched on it before with talking about your PhD, but it feels like you've reclaimed the word queer. And for you, it feels like almost, is it right to say, empowering, that you can use it in your own domain?
Yeah, and I think it follows other people having reclaimed it before me, if I'm honest. So in politics, especially in the 80s and 90s, I've always been a big fan of Judith Butler and writers who write, you know, about language and sexuality, and who've reclaimed that, and who are known as queer theorists. I mean, I think certainly it is a word that is still a difficult word, and that whenever I use it, I'm conscious that you know, that it still has the power to upset. And so I think it is a word that you have to accept that. But I mean, this is always the way with language. I think that words often can have both positive and negative connotations, and that so much of it depends on context and who is speaking as to what the impact of the word or phrase is going to be.
And I think this is one of the challenges when we're introducing a more diverse curriculum into Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4, is training staff to be able to speak with that nuance, even if they're not necessarily part of one of the minority communities. So understanding how any of the language of hate associated with race or gender or sexuality, that it can be used as an insult, but then equally it might be used as reclaimed language, and helping children to understand that when it's used in this way, it's not okay, and these are the reasons why. And when it's used in this way, it's acceptable, and these are the reasons why. And, you know, sometimes teenagers who think in a bit of a binary way might sometimes struggle with that. And I think that there's really some training to be done with teachers if they're going to explore stuff like this, because otherwise you can get yourself into a bit of a pickle with the class. Like some people are saying, well, Miss said it was all right to say queer. And that's definitely something that if they could understand the nuance of language, that it then allows them to make choices about their language. It's interesting, like when I think about language, the way language has evolved since I was at school, and certainly since you were at school as well, like gay is a pejorative, or all of those words associated with homosexual insults, and actually some racial slurs as well, were really quite common in school. But then we look at the ending of Section 28 and some of the ways that the newspapers have changed the way that they write. A lot of that language has faded out of school, and it's much more uncommon that you would hear in schools. But in terms of language of misogyny, language that is transphobic and Islamophobic, that I would say still persists. And I think that there's something important to do about like repeatedly challenging it and educating children about why that's not okay. So, 20 years ago, people thought it was okay to say this, and you recognize that's wrong. Now let's explore this and why you might think it is or isn't okay.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. Like from the experience I've had growing up as someone who encountered homophobia in the newspapers, and the effect that it had on me, and on seeing, talking heads on TV, just kind of it rolling off their tongue, it really makes me aware of the mechanisms of prejudice in terms of characterizing particular minority groups in a blanket generalized way as all predatory, all rapists, all terrorists, or what have you. And the fact that I think it is important to acknowledge that there has, as you say, there's been development in that area around homophobia, and people, not using in the media the language that they were using a few decades ago, and that it's good to recognize that pattern, and that change happened because people flagged it up, and people before me, activists, challenged that, and that we can challenge misogynistic language used, Islamophobic language used, transphobic language used, because it does operate under a similar logic a lot of the time.
What difference do you think it would have made to you as a young man growing up if there had been LGBTQ plus representation, either through the staff in your school or maybe more importantly through your curriculum?
Oh, I think it would have been amazing. So yeah, in the age of Section 28, I didn't encounter books, any texts which referenced it explicitly. And so it was just something that I buried. And I think if I'd had a teacher who was out, or if I was studying a text where, there were two men or two women, or, someone else who was outside the norm, in quotation marks, I think that just it would have allowed headspace where just it would have allowed me to kind of like internalize positive ideas. So yeah, I certainly, my experience growing up, I didn't even contemplate the possibility of being out at school. Other people might have, used slurs against me and said, you're gay or whatever. But it wasn't until I'd left home that, I even, it was even a thought that I could own that identity, that, I couldn't just hide it away in the back of my mind and try to, pass.
And there is definitely something about that normalization of things. Like I always say, like, I'm out at school, I'm an out head teacher, I talk about being gay in assembly. I mean, not like anything explicit, but in like Gay Pride month, I talked a little bit about my grandma and about how I was outed to my grandma by accident by my brother, who was, so I was at university in London, living the big gay life in London, which was amazing for me, having grown up in Devon. And my brother said to my nan, oh yeah, because Lindsay went to university as a vegetarian teetotal lesbian, and then realised what he'd said. And Grandma looked at my mum and she was like, yeah, she is. And Grandma was like, oh, okay, all right then. And despite the fact that, my nan had grown up in the 20s, all of, you know, the legality around that, and the homophobia, and like it not being considered okay at all at that time, she just was totally cool about it. And that she'd been in a garden centre, and she had ended up sharing a table because they were having lunch and some other woman didn't have a table. She shared a woman, and the woman and her were having a chit chat, an older woman, and the woman was talking about her family, and my nan asked if she had a daughter, and she said, "Oh, we do have a daughter, but we don't talk about her." She was like, "Oh, right, why not?" She was like, "Well, she's with a woman." And my nan was like, "Oh, right, okay, so why don't you talk about her?" And she said, "Oh, well, you know, it's not, we don't really feel comfortable with it, it's not really okay." And my nan said, "I don't get it. My granddaughter's a lesbian, and I don't know why you would want anything for your child other than for them to be happy." And then the woman started crying, and she said, "Oh, maybe I'm going to change my mind. If you think it's okay, maybe it is okay." And so I said to my nan, like, "Grandma, you wouldn't believe the difference you have made to that woman's life by making her mum think it might be okay." She was like, "Oh, don't be so bloody ridiculous, you know, like totally fine." But I told that story to the kids, and it really resonated with them that, like, actually being an advocate matters. So you don't have to be LGBTQ+. What you do have to be is a person who's saying it's okay, and be accepting and be kind. And like our motto here is work hard, be kind. But you see kids actively and proactively doing that because we have those narratives in school. And like, for me, that feels quite exciting. But I'm very aware that apart from in our PSHE curriculum, where it's quite rich, and in our assemblies, LGBTQ identities are a bit lacking in the curriculum, and that's why I'm excited to be part of this project. But in terms of text for the English curriculum, I think that some people wouldn't know, like they might want their curriculum to be more diverse, but they wouldn't know where to find those texts. Obviously, you teach creative writing and poetry at university. Have you got any recommendations that you think of people they should look at, or particular poems that you think, yeah, kids would like that one, that would be a good one?
So one book that they might look at is Dean Atter's The Black Flamingo. Dean is a young Black poet who's gay, and that book, I think, is aged, the readership is 12 and up. So I think so much of it is also around getting the right, pitching it, you know, at the right level. I'm really aware, like, I don't usually write for children. Like most of my stuff is for adult readers, and so I think just having, approaching it from the right angle, that's one that I definitely recommend. I mean, it's weird. I think that I probably don't know enough books that are out there of you know, for the different age groups, and so I'd love to hear other people's recommendations too, of stuff that I might be able to direct people to in future. I think I've seen quite a few for much younger, but I think Dean's is one of the few kind of books of poems that's really you know, aimed at young teens, really, that age group.
Somebody has just recommended Strawberries by Edwin Morgan. And it's interesting what you talk about there with whether or not it's a child-specific thing, because I think that when you look at our Key Stage 3 curriculum, and our Key Stage 4 curriculum especially, all of the texts they study at Key Stage 4 are designed for adults. They're not written for children. Oh, somebody said Malorie Blackman's Boys Don't Cry as well. We teach, so we have a thing which I love here called the Canon, which is where every day children sit in their tutor groups, and every year group reads together. So they're all in their individual tutor groups, but they read a text. So everyone at the moment is reading text A in year group year 7, and then the same for year 8 all the way through to 11. And they read out loud, and my tutor reads out loud. And Bus 57 is on that, which is a really great book exploring trans identities. But we've also got The Lies We Tell Ourselves by Robin Talley, which is really interesting. And that's interesting because it's exploring LGBTQ identities, but also Black and white relations at a time in America when Black kids weren't allowed to go to a white school, and the first Black child is going to attend a white school. But the kids then read those, and then that starts to be the conversations that they're having at break time, that they're talking about the texts rather than talking about whatever else it is, that TikTok and things like that. So it's nice, like it becomes part of their cultural identity. But but I think it is not difficult to put these texts in, but there's definitely a little bit of fear attached to it, and about how we might then teach those and deal with some of the issues that come up. So sorry, I'm just checking the chat there to make sure that I hadn't missed any.
I think I've remembered one. The first ones that I read was Carol Ann Duffy's "Warming Her Pearls." Do you know that one?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. Kind of, I think partly because it's in a historical context, and it's kind of saying that, you know,
Yeah.
there were women in love with women in the past too. I've got two cats named after characters from Sarah Waters, Tipping the Velvet. So yeah, nice. I'm very much into my historical lesbians.
And it's funny, I don't think people who haven't been in a minority group or felt that they don't see themselves know what it feels like. But I really remember being 17 and going into the Works in Exeter, which is like the cheap stationery shop. And I was a bit of a romantic, I thought it was really profound because I was 17. And I saw a book called Love Letters. And it was by Paul Gambaccini. I picked it up because it was called Love Letters, not knowing that it was a gay man had written it. And then I got home and I remember just crying throughout because it was just an openly gay book about gay love. And then I distinctly remember the year after, the first time I ever went to a gay club, and I saw two men kissing. And I remember thinking it was one of the most profound, beautiful things I'd seen, because I'd never really been able to connect with love that I'd seen before. And then suddenly, you know, people use that horrible phrase now, I feel seen, but it was that, oh, wow. Oh, it isn't just me. I'm not on my own. And I think that literature's got a potential to create that for kids, which would be nice if they just felt a little bit less alone, right?
Absolutely. Growing up, like, I remember so many, well, almost every pop song was, you know, boy meets girl, and like it just didn't seem like a possibility that, you know, that there were other people before me who were feeling the way that I did. And so just kind of normalizing that you know, that a boy can fall in love with a boy, a girl can fall in love with a girl is wonderful when it's just presented as not strange, not, you know, just another way of being.
Yeah, and I do think there are some things to be mindful of when introducing text into the curriculum. So actually, the first one that you kind of touched on it earlier, that you talked about queer joy in your poetry, the idea that we don't just explore LGBTQ issues as being something that caused pain and homophobia and transphobia and misery. That's not the narrative we want to share and with everyone too, that it can just be, it can be a happily ever after. And I think anyone wanting to introduce text like that into their curriculum need to really find that balance of celebratory texts and sort of incidental texts. So, and this can be done across the curriculum as well as in English, but just including identities where they happen to be gay. The story's not about them being gay, they just happen to be gay. And more that's starting to happen in the media, and in Netflix are doing it particularly well, I have to say. So it used to be that if there was a gay character, there did have to be a coming out bit, and there did have to be like a homophobically bullied bit, because otherwise what was the point of them being gay in the story? And that isn't really the case anymore, like in mainstream, you know, the dramas and things like that. But it would be important, I think, to select a range of texts so that it's the positive stories as well as the negative ones. I think some teachers might not always feel comfortable with some of the content. In terms of like talking about sexuality and diversity with teachers, you obviously talk about that with your students, but they're young adults. Have you got any advice that you might offer to teachers about how they can do that with sensitivity, particularly if they may have LGBTQ plus pupils in their classroom?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm probably not experienced enough in that teaching environment to be kind of rolling it down the mount as, you know, this is how you can do it. I suppose I know with teaching that there's often this worry about authority, but not being afraid to have things more open and to use qualifiers and to tread carefully. I think that these are things which are it's very easy to say the wrong thing, or to be so worried about saying the wrong thing on the other hand that you don't go near the subject at all, which is not helpful. I think to own, that we all well, most of us trying to grow in these areas and learning by listening to people with different experiences to ourselves. I'm still learning and growing, and I will until I die, like listening to other people and, their experiences of prejudices that I haven't encountered, areas where I have privilege myself.
Yeah, of course. And I think all of us being aware of that privilege and aware of the lack of privilege in others is something that we need to explore with the kids. Like, where is it more challenging for others, and how might we facilitate their life being easier? We talk about that a lot with the children, where we commented earlier about the nuance of language and about, well, in this context it might be offensive, but in this one not. We talk a lot about, if you're not sure, try to use other words that won't be offensive, because you wouldn't want to offend someone by accident. And generally, I think children get pretty much on board with that, because they're not trying to argue with people. I think there are a few things that if people want to create a more diverse curriculum, that they definitely need to consider. So one, I don't think it needs to be a discrete part of the curriculum, like, oh, it's Pride Month, so now we're going to do the gay texts. I think this peppering of diversity across the curriculum, because we're trying to say diversity is part of our community, and we don't tolerate, we celebrate, but it's just part of our everyday, rather than it being a discrete thing, I think would be an important thing. And we touched briefly on it before, but the idea that we would talk about people, role models, Alan Turing, for example, and it's inconsequential that he's gay, but just letting them know that there are great gay people. There's a poem that they study in the anthology for GCSE if they do AQA, Checking Out My History, where it talks about like the range of people in history who are Black and great that are never taught. And there's, there would be a similar poem that could be written about LGBTQ plus people. And so those are the kind of things that they could draw in quite easily across their curriculum. I think that definitely for teachers, there would need to be some pre-planning in a group so that they feel comfortable, because the last thing that you want is teachers teaching things that they feel uncomfortable with, because that discomfort is going to come across to the kids. The one thing that we've done, actually, and we've been quite clear about, is where in our curriculum we're going to be teaching or exploring issues that are more complex and that might raise pastoral issues for people. We've let the pastoral team know in advance, and then we've ensured that kids know where they can get support. So we've got an LGBT group, but we've also got an email for support with those kind of things, because kids don't always want to go in person, because they don't necessarily, if the first step of seeking support in your school is that you have to step into the room where they're having the LGBT club, that's quite a public, bold thing to do. And so making sure that we've got ways that they can access that privately online first, and then step into kind of a wider, more public, proud thing. And then actually it's interesting, because we have a lot of out children here, but I think that is because our curriculum and our staff are so open and diverse and accepting, and we've got that alongside the highest level of diversity in terms of ethnic background in the whole of Exeter. So the two things alongside each other, celebrating each other and supporting each other, and then there's a real sense of like celebrating culture. But I think that's because of the curriculum. But I don't think it's easy, as is probably demonstrated by the fact that this book that Collins have created is like one of the first I've seen about proactively, deliberately diversifying the curriculum, which is a bit of a shame. I think we are running into the place where we probably need to move to some questions. So we've got a chat open. I guess the questions that you might want to have a think about would be either specifics about implementing diversity into your curriculum and some of the nuance around that, but also, and probably far more interesting, some questions for John about his poetry, about his life experiences, or about the poem specifically, if you are familiar with it. So I think I'm just going to watch the chat here and then respond to the questions as they come in. So someone is asking me if I have taught the lesson. So I'm now a head teacher, which means that I mostly don't do any teaching because, yeah, but I'm a novice head teacher. So I started being a head teacher in September 2019, and then the world fell apart. So like my first year of head teacher was that their school closed. So I'm really aware that actually I've got to practice being a head teacher and be good at that before I go back to teaching. But it's being put into, so I run the common curriculum. So we have a curriculum across our whole trust, and it's being put into our trust curriculum, as with all of the resources from that, because like we've made a decision, for example, that we're not going to be teaching of mice and men anymore, because we think that although it has racism and misogyny, etc., and disabled prejudice in it, we don't think it explicitly condemns or explores those in a way that we feel happy with. So we've moved away from that, and then we are introducing actually loads of the resources. But so yes, Queer Cult will be in our curriculum, but I won't be teaching it, unfortunately, at present. I've got a nice question here for you, John. It says, which poets have had a major impact on you when you were growing up and starting to write poetry?
The way that I started writing poetry was all very much intricately connected to school and teaching. So I did Sylvia Plath at school, much beloved by many a teenager, and me too. I think that she has her writing has a special appeal for people at that point in their lives, because it's so passionate and the imagery is so kind of intense and violent. And when you're in that kind of stage of being very uncertain, that really spoke to me. So I got really into Sylvia Plath, and I think we did Emily Dickinson at A-level for my A-level English poetry text. So those two definitely really got me into poetry. And then as I grew older, I think, who do I particularly like? Frank O'Hara was a gay American poet writing in the 50s and 60s, really funny, humorous, camp, manic poems, often set on the streets of New York. So he was another early influence on my work too. Oh, and Elizabeth Bishop I love as well, thinking about famous lesbian and gay writers of the past. Yeah, Elizabeth Bishop.
Tell me about Elizabeth Bishop, because I'm writing her name down, because I like Frank O'Hara. Yes, totally. I've not heard of Elizabeth Bishop.
Oh, she's amazing. So Elizabeth Bishop's writing in the middle of the 20th century, and she spent some of her life in Brazil. Her life partner was Lourdes de Mejía Suárez, who was a diplomat. She writes, one of her most famous ones is "The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master." It's in this form called a villanelle, and it's written after the death of her partner. It's really moving stuff, but her work often uses imagery from geography. She's very interested in observation of environment, so her work's often quite lush in its physical detail. So she'll often describe seascapes or rainforests or things like that, but using them as a metaphor for kind of emotional or spiritual concerns.
I feel like you've had a better gay education than I have.
Start with the shampoo. Start with the shampoo, which is a really funny poem, partly because it's about an ungendered speaker washing the hair of someone with, someone with long hair. And she got it published, and her friends were like, "Oh, isn't it great to have like a poem exploring lesbian desire in this big, international publication?" She was just like, "I don't think it's at all obvious that it's about a lesbian relationship," and it so is. It's all about the pleasure that one woman's taking in, attending to, her lover's long hair. And uses lots of like surreal imagery around stars and planets, and the hair is like comets. Like she's got grey hairs that are like comets in her long dark hair. So yeah, it's a beautiful queer love poem.
That sounds ace. I'm going to ask you a really lame question now, because you talk so passionately about poems. Do you have a favourite, like the one that you've got to read this? I mean, it can be by you, obviously.
I think that would be a bit much. There are so many. I would find it really hard to just pick one. Oh gosh. I suppose there's a Frank O'Hara one called "Having a Coke with You," that I often go back to, thinking about Sylvia Plath. Which ones do I particularly like? There's one called Among the Narcissi, that, yeah, I've often used in my teaching over the years. But there are so many. I think it partly depends on what mood I'm in. Like, I find that, like, you know, as with food and things, like, different moods call for different poems, whether I want to read something, you know, that's sad or celebratory or what have you.
It's funny that you're set against your bookshelves. For years and years and years, I would always have all my books in the living room, apart from my poetry that was always in my bedroom, because there's something about being in the safe place of your bedroom and quietly reading a poem or going back to a poem that for me is just, I don't know, it's so important. It's really nice actually on so I have an apartment in Spain because my grandchildren are Spanish, and so we've got a little apartment there, and they, as part of the cultural celebration across the year, they wrote poetry all around the village, and Different Hope is a thing with feathers on the side of my apartment building, which is just so lovely. I love the fact that that was the one they chose. I love a bit of Emily Dickinson. In fact, actually, as part of my university degree, I wrote Emily Dickinson, lesbian imagery in Emily Dickinson's poetry, arguing that there was loads of it.
Lots of gender swapping, lots of poems where she's a boy and things, yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah. My lecturer didn't really agree that there was any, but I was sure that there was. But it's been a while.
Oh, Wild Nights. That's such a lesbian love poem.
Right. Exactly. Okay, I've got another question here. It says, it's interesting to hear about how we've incorporated an inclusive curriculum in the school. That's obviously me. Do I think that it is important for students to have LGBTQ teachers who are out and who are role models in school? I think it is infinitely valuable, but I do think that there is a danger in asking the people who have most to lose to be the people who are the ones who have to stand up. So like being an out teacher in school can still make you feel quite vulnerable. You know, if it's the PE teacher who they don't want to be in the changing room, or the school where behaviour isn't where it should be and they get called insulting names, or, you know, where there's insinuation that you're behaving this way or that way. I think it can leave people feeling quite vulnerable. And I've been really pretty fortunate where I haven't been in positions like that. But I know that is the case with some people, and I think that people feel unsurprisingly a bit scared about that. When I wrote my article for The Guardian, that like I was shocked by how popular it was. Like it was the most read article of that year. Like which shocked me because I'd never written a bloody article before. I just wrote it because I was in a mood. And the reason I was in a mood is because I'd been out for dinner with my girlfriend and we were with a whole bunch of lesbians, and two of the lesbians dropped hands and suddenly we're all separate. And I was like, what are you doing? And they said, they were primary school teachers. My girlfriend at the time was a primary school teacher. And they were like, oh, there are some parents over there and like, we can't be out. I was like, why not? And they were like, it just won't be okay. And, you know, look at the stats from Stonewall, and still there's a sense that people wouldn't want their kid taught by an openly gay teacher. So I think, yes, it's really important and brilliant, but it can never be done until you're in a school where everything else means that it's safe for that person. I think it would be safe here, but equally, if we had staff who didn't want to be out to the kids, like I would be really comfortable with that and supporting. But I do think it's helpful, and I think it's helpful. Like mostly now, I'm pleased to say, mostly the kids don't care, right? They just don't care. They're like, nah, okay, yeah. Apart from that, I do think that there are people who, you know, no one cares except for the people that do care. Those ones whose uncle might be gay, or who might be wondering if their sister's gay or if they're gay, and or the cleaner whose daughter is trans, or whatever it might be. I think that those people quietly care because they suddenly see that it's okay, and that there is a community, and that it is safe. And for me, like, I think it's important in my role that I'm out, partly because there's no way I am not holding my girlfriend's hand when I go out in the street, because I love her so much. I don't want to have to hide that, number one. And number two, I think it's important that they can see I can be girly, I'm wearing a dress and heels today, like I can be girly and be gay, and I can be successful and be gay, and that those, you know, it's helpful to see those things in it. Somebody here says they don't know how to access the sample lesson mentioned in the first chat. I would love to be able to help you with that, but I am not very good at computers. And I'm hoping that it's going to be okay, because someone from the HarperCollins team is going to magically make it appear in a link or something. Someone has actually said they're going to look and see if they can find it. Right, I think we're coming shortly to an end, so it's kind of final calls on any questions if anyone has any more. Okay, so I've got another one here. Any tips for teachers who want to introduce new poems or text but think they might face resistance from their school? So I guess the first place is where that resistance may come from. And I guess there would be 4 core areas. So parents, pupils, the senior team, and the governors. I think it's unlikely from other teachers, maybe, but I think that's less likely. So I think that you would tackle each one in a different way. So with governors, I would go with a proposal with, here are the benefits, here's what the stats say. And you can go look on Stonewall, there's a lot of statistics there, but actually doing some basic work within your own school community can work really well. I would say that was the same with tackling it with the leadership team. So going to the governors or leadership team with, this is the problem, here are some ways I can think we can diversify our curriculum and help make it better. And if you need some evidence that you've got a problem in your school, there's a lovely thing that I did as part of my master's, which is you work with the kids, pick a year group or a class and say, okay, I want you to write down every pejorative word that you use, anything, you're not going to get in trouble, literally anything. So you get the C-bomb and all that sort of stuff. And you say, okay, right, now I want you to underline the ones that you know are bad or wrong and that you shouldn't say. And then they do that. And then you say, okay, now I want you to tick the ones you use. And what I have found historically when I've done it is that they recognize that language related to race is wrong, and that they recognize that language related to disability is wrong, that they shouldn't. Some still use it, but they recognize they shouldn't. But that often language related to homophobia or misogyny, they don't think is wrong. And that couldn't scream more loudly, we have a problem here. So that's a really nice piece of evidence to take to a senior team. Obviously, like seek support there, like, and make sure that they're aware you're doing that. If it's the children and the parents, and I think that maybe that might be more difficult with, so with the children, I think if you're in a school where behavior isn't excellent, that's harder. And I think that the best way to do that will be to introduce the lessons and be like, listen, these are the parameters of the lesson. These are the things that will be okay, and these are the things that are not okay. And I want to know everyone is clear on that before we begin, so that people are clear about the parameters, because otherwise I think you could end up with some children saying things that are offensive or upsetting for some, and then being like, oh, well, I didn't know it wasn't okay. So I think that would be important in terms of the children. In terms of parents, which I think is the most sticky part, I think writing to them to let them know that we're going to have a broad curriculum is important to do, and just letting them know that part of our British values that we're told that we have to, I don't think they are British values, I think they're like common sense human values, but part of our British values that we're told that we need to share and teach in schools is that acceptance of diversity. And so I think sharing with them what the curriculum is going to be would probably be the most important thing. But anything that you're going to introduce, you need to, one, recognize that you're going to have some people who don't like it, and that's fine. Always give them an audience and always deal with it face on. Never leave it, because then it will build up in you of anxiety doom. And always do it as a face-to-face conversation, because if they see you as a human rather than as a political argument, you will get a very, very different response. So like the human first thing, and meeting with them as soon as you can is a really good bit of advice, I think. Someone has asked, is there modern equality in schools, and are religious schools less or more accommodating? That is a great question. Is there equality in schools? I think it is more equal than it has ever been, but I think that there isn't equality in society, and thus they're probably, you know, it's like a microcosm of society. I've never worked in a religious school, so I really couldn't tell you if they were more or less accommodating. I don't know if you've got any experience, John, in that area.
No, I've not been to one myself.
No, I just haven't worked in one. But my experience with people of faith, I've got a deputy head here who is a very, very dedicated Christian, is that if I'm sad, he brings me chocolate. And when my girlfriend was isolating because she had COVID, he brought me beer. So for me, the people I've experienced who have faith, as a general rule, have always tried to put love first and put human beings first, and try to think like, how can I be a kind human? And so mostly that's been my personal experience, but I can't answer the question about schools. There's a nice question here, John. If you could recommend one amazing and up and coming contemporary poet to teachers, who would it be? So they've got to be amazing, up and coming contemporary.
I suppose in terms of quite recent poets, maybe Kayo Chingonyi did a book called, I think it's called A Blood Condition. He explores Black identity, Black history, and I think he's great on the page, great in performance. And what I also like is that because he's much cooler than I am. He's very kind of like, he's got a musical background and he's interested in urban music. And so I think that his work has a particular appeal for younger people too. And another one, Caleb Femi won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection this year with his book, Poor, which I think similarly has a really broad appeal. Might be particularly, of interest.
It's funny you should say that, because his poem 13 is either in the Key Stage 3 or the Key Stage 4 collection. It might be the Key Stage 4 one, or it might be the Key Stage 3 one. I'm not sure, but it's a great poem. Okay, another question for you, John. So you mentioned the prevalence of boy meets girl narratives in schools, and no, not in schools, in songs and in popular cultures. How far do you think that's improved with artists such as, this is going to show how uncool I am because I'm not really sure how to say this, Lil Nas X, who I think is the black rapper guy, but I might not be. And where do you think that we have the most work to do? Is it better?
I think that it's improved immeasurably since my day of, as if I'm really ancient, but like, no, certainly growing up, there were just no, there were hardly any out gay and lesbian pop stars at all. I think Lil Nas X is amazing and has really changed the game and has really inspired, I think, other artists to be more bold and more out. I think that with this generation now, Arlo Parks, there are so many. Where do I think there's most work to do? I suppose maybe around, in this area, maybe around trans artists. Like, I often think that there aren't enough trans authors that get as much prominence and, you know, in the media and being read in popular culture and maybe in songs. Maybe that's an area where there might still be work to do.
Someone said, this is an interesting question. I'm going to put it to you first because you work in a university. You're used to such high-minded discussions. Do you think there is an increasing jargon problem with the LGBTQ plus discussion?
I think inevitably in a university context, you're always going to get words which are jargon in terms of, like, you know, long words that lots of people understand. I think as time goes on, I guess the problem is that society changes and we do need new words to capture new nuances of identity. So when I was coming out in the 90s, it was all about, are you lesbian, gay or bisexual? And there wasn't, you know, as much. And then there was kind of a slight awareness of trans issues, but certainly, you know, the vocabulary around gender fluidity, non-binary identity is something that wasn't, you know, part of the debate. And we do need new words. And I suppose part of the problem is that then we still have the old words, and there's kind of, you know, people in different generations maybe have different words at their fingertips. So I think that it can be a problem in the terms of people being not familiar with particular terms. You have to be careful about the group of people that you're talking to. When I'm talking to a non-specifically queer audience, then I don't tend to use very queer specific terms like bears or something, which I think that which would just baffle a lot of you know, strict people. But I think we do need we do still need new words to capture young people's experiences of who they are and how they, you know, experience gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and I do think that there's definitely a fear attached from some people that they don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah.
And so because they don't want to get it wrong, they then are dismissive or say, oh, there's too many. But actually, that, like, we both are in the business of education, right? I mean, that's literally our jobs. You've got a somewhat more impressive version of that. But like, if we're teaching people to read and explore and learn about people's lives and experience, then using language to positively identify exactly what that experience is, to me, seems like a positive thing rather than a negative thing. I've really enjoyed talking to you, John. I'm going to pass briefly back to Roisin now, and I'm going to finally be quiet.
Yeah, so sorry to have to interrupt that. That was so interesting. Thank you so much, John and Lindsay, for coming along and sharing all of your expertise today, and for everyone else for coming along to watch and asking such interesting questions. It's been so interesting to listen along to, so thank you so much. Just as a reminder, we will announce the winner of the prize draw after the session, and we'll be in touch to arrange the delivery of your copy of Who We Are, featuring John's poem, which is so exciting, and we'll also circulate the recording after we finish as well. So yeah, nothing more to say other than thank you so much, and yes, goodbye.